I'll speak about the future of work, and I'll in particular speak to it from my own perspective within machine learning. So I would define machine learning as the study of algorithms that can learn and act. And the interesting thing about that definition is that it means that we're explicitly designing things that can do tasks that are perhaps most quintessentially human, in that, we have millions of humans already on Earth. Why does it actually make sense to design substitutes for that kind of labor? So in answer to that question, I'd like to point to the following plot from perhaps my favorite study of all time. It was a study of Israeli judges who were tasked with awarding parole to parole seekers. So you see on the y-axis the fraction of times that they awarded parole to one of these poor prisoners, and on the x-axis the ordinal position throughout the day. So you can see that early in the morning, let's see if I can get this laser pointer to work, maybe not. Early in the morning, they start out quite generous towards those prisoners, only for that generosity to decline as they get further and further away from their breakfast. They're perked up by their morning coffee, only for that to decline again leading into lunch. And as you can see, post-lunch is more or less a complete write-off. So I'm aware that in the proceedings of the day, we're somewhere around here. So as a consequence, I'll have to beg your generosity in appraising the talk. Thank you very much. But the deeper point I'm trying to make here is that, there really is a demand for decision-making that's free of some of the less desirable characteristics of human decision-making, in that by using algorithms, we are able to design decision-makers that are uncorrupted by heuristics and biases that plague human decision-making. So that's one reason you might want to prefer an algorithm to a human. And the other reason, of course, is perhaps familiar to us all. So it's simply that algorithms are an increasingly cheap alternative to human work. So what you see here on the y-axis is the cost of a single unit of computation, and on the x-axis, a timeline all the way from 1940 to the current day. And as I'm sure you've seen in many other plots of similar design, there has been this really long-running downward decline in that cost of computation, with the obvious exception of the iPad 2 there on the far right-hand side. So associated with this development of increasingly cheap computation has been the rise of what's come to be known as big data. That is, we really are gathering information, data at a scale unlike anything we've seen in the past. And again, this is probably a point that's familiar to many of you, but let me just put some numbers to exactly the scale of that phenomenon. So take an estimate of the information contained in all the printed material in the world, which was about 200 petabytes. There was another estimate made of the information contained in all the words ever spoken by human beings, which was about 5 exabytes. And interestingly, both of those numbers are completely dwarfed by the predicted internet traffic this year, which is expected to approach 1 zettabyte. So to me, it would actually be enormously surprising if we weren't able to do something with all this data that exceeds what we're able to do with human labor. That actually there is an enormous opportunity here for algorithms to perform previously unautomatable tasks. And to some extent, we're already seeing that. So I imagine many of you have had the opportunity to use Google Translate, which is interesting because it wasn't so long ago that machine translation, the use of an algorithm to translate written text from one language to another, was seen as more or less impossible. There was a very long period of time in which very little progress was made in that problem. And what changed? Well, it was very much just big data. So the success of Google's algorithm was in drawing upon a variety of corpuses of text pre-translated for their purposes. And one particularly useful example was that of the UN, which by its charter is required to translate all its official documents into its 6 different constituent languages. So as a result, if Google is required to translate a short phrase, 2 or 3 words, that it can find in one of those documents, it has ready-made access to 5 alternative translations, which it can return to its users. So concretely, that is one way that big data has enabled the automation of a task that was previously the reserve of humans alone. Another, perhaps even more relevant example is that of autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, are not usually presented as being the result of big data, but let me describe to you why in fact they are. So for a long time actually, cars have had more or less all they needed to be autonomous. It's not been, that recently that we've been able to put computers in cars. That's been around for a while. We've been able to equip cars with sensors for quite a long time. safety systems, and similar kind of devices. Really what's changed in the recent past is the availability of very detailed maps of the environments in which these cars might find themselves. So in particular, Google again has amassed these kind of inch-precision maps of the road networks that their vehicles are required to traverse. And as a result, all that's really required in order to equip a vehicle to be completely automated is providing it with the right bit of code that allows it to exploit the data that has already been gathered. So as a consequence of those technologies, self-driving cars, and similar kinds of technologies drawing upon big data and advances within my own field of machine learning, it's almost certain that we'll see the automation of many further tasks that have previously only been performed by humans. So I've got here some examples from the recent past. In the upper right, you can see the QC bot, which is automating the task of delivering meals and medicines around hospitals. Over on the left, we've got the OSH bot, which is this cuddly little fella deployed by Orchid Supply Hardware in California to essentially not only recommend products to customers, and in doing so draw upon big data characterizing the spending patterns of many other customers. It's also a robot in its own right and can hence guide that customer to exactly the product that they might desire. And perhaps most importantly for the economy of my own country, that of Australia, is the rise of autonomous mining vehicles. So to give you some context, in my native state of Western Australia, these mines are in very remote regions and drivers have to be paid on the order of 180,000 Australian dollars per year to be induced to drive one of these vehicles. So of course there's an enormous economic incentive to introduce algorithms able to perform that task. And in fact that technological question has more or less already been solved. And our best estimates are that if the big miners decided to do so, they could automate as many as 3/4 of their current fleet of vehicles tomorrow. So this is very much something that is in the process of happening. So then the obvious next question is, if these robots and algorithms can drive vehicles better than me, if they can draw upon those data sets characterizing spending patterns to better recommend products to customers, and certainly if they can dig through data better than I can, what am I actually still any good for? So a component of our study was to try and identify what the characteristics of jobs were that would render them safe from automation. So in particular, we had this intuition that there were 3 bottlenecks to computerization, as we labeled them, 3 characteristics that were going to be beyond the scope of automation for at least the next 20 years or so. So those 3 bottlenecks were social intelligence, creativity, and perception. And what unites those 3 different characteristics is that in each, humans possess a vast reservoir of tacit knowledge that's very difficult for us to reproduce in code. So let's take perhaps the most intuitive example, that of creativity. It's easy to design an algorithm that can churn out an endless stream of songs, a particular example of a creative task. But what's difficult is to teach that algorithm the difference between a good song and a bad song. Because in making that kind of creative judgment, we as humans are drawing upon an enormous internal database of cultural knowledge and societal contexts that's very difficult for us to actually write out in code in such a way that an algorithm could reproduce those judgments. So then, with those bottlenecks in mind, we tried to amass some numbers to put weight behind our intuitions. So in particular, we turned to the US, where for 702 different occupational categories, we have not just the usual kind of measures of those occupations, things like average income, education, and employment, the number of people who work in that job, but also, very interestingly for us, characteristics of exactly what that job requires. So in the US, there's an agency known as ONET, which actually goes out and surveys workers in each of those occupations and asks them exactly what it is that their jobs require. So for each of these 700 different jobs, we get a vector of characteristics detailing things like the requirement for finger dexterity, for persuasion, caring for others, negotiation, the requirement to work in cramped spaces. all these characteristics that we thought might be reflective of a job's susceptibility to automation, in that we think that things like persuasion, for example, might not be readily automated or replaced by machine. So then, at this point, we, interestingly, actually turned to a machine learning algorithm. So what we did was take all this data, plug it into an algorithm, and have it tell us what it thought the susceptibility of different jobs might be. Now, in order to do that, we need to teach the algorithm. We need to give it some examples of jobs that we think are non-automatable, at least for the foreseeable future, 20 years or so, and examples of occupations that probably are automatable. So at the top of this list of occupations, you can see an example of an occupation that we told the algorithm was automatable. It was data entry keys, which I think is relatively easy to defend. At the other end of the spectrum, we told the algorithm that clergy, for example, were non-automatable due to the kind of deep requirements, you could argue, for social intelligence that the priesthood requires. So in response to those kinds of labels, the algorithm came back and gave us all the numbers in the rightmost column. So it told us that, yes, indeed, data entry keyers were automatable, as were tax preparers. Slightly more interesting, umpires and referees. Make up your own mind on that. Industrial truck operators, exactly due to the influence of these self-driving technologies, will be automatable. And at the other end of the spectrum, it told us that people like choreographers were probably non-automatable, again due to the requirement for creativity and social intelligence. But the interesting thing about our approach is that the algorithm we used wasn't forced to slavishly follow what we told it. It was an intelligent learning machine in its own right, and by detecting the kind of latent trends in the labels we had given it, was able to, in some cases, override what we had told it, to kind of pick out those hidden characteristics of jobs that were, in fact, more predictive of automatability and to correct what were likely to be human mistakes. So one example, which is quite interesting, was that of waiters and waitresses. So you can see that we had told the algorithm that they were non-automatable. The label was 0. But actually, the algorithm came back and told us that the probability of computerization for waiters and waitresses was pretty close to 1, 0.94. So remember, we did this study back in 2013. And in fact, I would argue that in the interim, the algorithm's prediction has been borne out in the real world. So since publishing this study, we've seen restaurants like Applebee's in the US roll out Ziosk tablets. So essentially, these are little devices that sit on tables in restaurants, can take customers' orders, and can show them, really delicious-looking photos of desserts that, in practice, lead people to order as much as 33% more dessert than they otherwise might have. So there were very real incentives there to replace human waiters and waitresses with these devices, and in practice, that has actually taken place, despite what we might have argued initially would have been the requirement to interact socially with customers in a way that an algorithm is still not able to do. So there's one further surprise. My co-author, Carl Frey, an economist, was quite keen to get into the algorithm the fact that economists were entirely non-automatable. So as you can see, we'd slapped it in there as a 0. The algorithm has come back and said that actually the probability is 50-50, or more or less. So all I can say in response to that is we'll have to wait and see. So then, taking all those numbers and weighting all the different occupations by the employment in those occupations, we're able to come up with a headline figure from our study that 47% of current US employment is at high risk of automation, where by high risk we mean has a probability of computerization that's greater than 0.7. So here is the plot that makes that point. You can see the enormous chunk of employment over on the right that's at high risk, and you can see it broken down into the different categories of employment that you might expect. So a lot of jobs in transportation and material moving, the brown streak, are at risk due to self-driving cars. We'll see sales and related occupations at risk due to the superior ability of algorithms to recommend products to customers. And similarly for office and administrative support in orange, where you could argue the superior ability of algorithms to dig through data, to access it and to process it in various ways as might be required, for example, in a payroll kind of occupation, will very soon exceed the human. On the left-hand side, you'll see occupations that probably encompass everybody in the room. So the occupations that are at low risk include those in management, business and financial occupations, education, arts and media occupations, and science and engineering occupations in blue, all of which I would argue contain, to one extent or another, one of these bottlenecks we identified. So I would say most of those occupations require some degree of social intelligence to manage other people, for example, or require some deep degree of creativity, as is the case, for example, in science and engineering occupations. So that was the US. In more recent work, we've reproduced the analysis for the UK in conjunction with Deloitte, and the overall stereo here is largely the same. There is a large chunk of employment that's at risk. The number was a little bit smaller. It was 35% rather than 47% at high risk, but I should mention that the two numbers aren't directly comparable because unfortunately the UK and US don't categorize occupations in exactly the same way. But nonetheless, the overall message is largely the same. In even more recent work, in conjunction with Nesta in the UK, we tried to put even more numbers to this expectation of ours that creative work was particularly safe from automation. And we were able to do that in the UK because the Department of Culture, Media and Sport actually labels, in its infinite wisdom, some occupations as being creative and other occupations as being non-creative. So we took those labels in exactly the same way that we took our labels of automatability, provided them with an algorithm, and got it to produce for all occupations exactly how probable it was that that occupation was creative. And then, of course, we can correlate the probability of creativity with the probability of computerizability. So on the y-axis of this plot, we have the creative probability. The higher, the more creative you are. And on the x-axis, we have the probability of computerization. And what you can see is that for the fraction of the workforce, and sorry, I should say the density of the square is employment, so that most of the UK sits out at a very high probability of computerization and relatively low creativity. But for the fraction of the workforce that we would label as most creative, that is, that has a probability of creativity greater than 0.7, the risk of computerization is negligible, which I think, as I say, provides further evidence to this hypothesis of ours that creativity is in some senses very secure from automation, at least for the foreseeable future. So this you may not be able to read at that great distance, but in an even more recent report with Citibank, we set out to answer a question that was put to us repeatedly, in that what could we say about the risk not just to individual occupations, but to entire industries, where of course an industry comprises many different occupations. HR managers, for example, exist across the full suite of industries here. So I appreciate that you probably won't be able to read these numbers, but the message I want to get across here is that really just that, again, we see enormous discrepancies, enormous differences between different industries. So at the top of the list, we have an industry like accommodation and food services with as high as 87% of current employment at high risk of computerization. And that's exactly due to things like those Xerox tablets that are being rolled out in restaurants and the ability of sites like Travelocity to take the role that might traditionally have been served by accommodation bookers. At the other end of the spectrum, we have industries like information with as little as 10% of employment at high risk of computerization. And what we mean by information is really computer engineers, software developers. And there again, I would argue that the degree of creativity required in those occupations really does render them relatively safe from automation. So now on to perhaps the most alarming finding from our original study. So another thing we tried to pick out was how this probability of computerization might be related to different measures of skill. So here we have two plots of the probability of computerization on the x-axis against two different measures of skill on the y-axis. On the top, the fraction of people in an occupation who have at least a bachelor's degree, and at the bottom, the average median wage in the occupation. So what you can see is that by either measure of skill, the more skilled you are, the more safe you are from automation. Which, as I say, is alarming because it suggests that the burden of automation will rest most heavily upon the shoulders of those of the least skilled. And I would further argue that the least skilled are probably least well equipped to move into whatever new jobs might be created. So if we look at the new jobs that have been created over the last 10 years, and here I draw this data from LinkedIn, they're jobs like iOS developers or data scientists or Zumba instructors, in fact. But the interesting thing about this is that all of those jobs certainly do contain one of those bottlenecks to automation, either the creativity inherent in an iOS developer or the social intelligence that a social media intern would possess. But that alarmingly, not only are many of these jobs quite high skilled, like iOS developers or data scientists, and hence inaccessible to those who are probably being put out of work by automation. In fact, the number of those jobs is also quite small. So a study from my co-author Carl Frey found that only 0.5% of the current US workforce is engaged in industries that didn't exist in the year 2000. So for all the hype over new digital industries, they haven't actually generated all that much employment. And I think that story is actually one quite familiar to us. If you think about the companies that have been in the news, let's take the example of WhatsApp. At the time that it was bought out for 19 billion US by Facebook, it had 55 employees. It had generated 55 jobs. If we compare that against previous industries, so let's take the example of fashion retailer Gap, which was valued at about the same at the same time, about 19 billion. It has 137,000 employees. So the challenge here is that the new industries that have emerged haven't really met the need for new job creation. So I guess my final point is that we really do need to think very seriously about this problem and make sure that we are encouraging the industries that will generate those forms of low-skilled work that will be the ones most susceptible to automation. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Social interaction side of especially the service industry, and I was very surprised to see figures for what I interpret as being restaurants or the service food accommodation as being so high, because while there's will be a growing need for tablet type stuff, I think people enjoy going to a restaurant and being served by people and not by robots, and I can't see that disappearing completely. I mean, there's going to be a healthy market, I would think, for people being served by people.
Okay, so a few things in response to that. I would agree certainly that there will remain some jobs in perhaps high-end restaurants for people who are providing that kind of social interaction with their customers. I'm not sure there are sufficient numbers of jobs in that kind of space. If we look historically, let's take the example of the typing pool of the 1950s. So people said that the typing pool could never be automated because actually they weren't just typing documents, they were doing things like taking dictation and providing social interaction with the other people in the workplace, making coffee perhaps, in a way that word processing software was never going to be able to replace. And for that reason, the typing pool would always stick around. But actually when the crunch came, the market basically decided that all those other things weren't actually sufficiently important to keep the people around. And I think that's what we're currently seeing in accommodation and food services. So yes, perhaps it is nice to interact with a human travel agent, but it's not nice enough that those jobs have been retained. And I think the same thing is going to happen in increasing numbers of in-person interactions in restaurants and similar kinds of services.
I was intrigued by the funeral attendants that on your list of professions that have a low probability of being replaced by a robot, because I would think, if you go to a funeral parlor, there are basically just two sentiments that you have. You're either aggrieved or you are overjoyed.
Yeah.
Person's demise, so I'm not sure, either 0 or 1. No, okay.
Well,
That's just a bit of jest, but
sure.
more questions. There, yeah.
roughly the next couple of decades. Yeah. Well, we don't know, and of course it's very difficult to forecast exactly what will transpire. We can look at this example of new jobs being created and say that actually we couldn't have anticipated any of those jobs being created 20 years ago. What I will say is that the question we set out to answer was just that of technological capabilities. So what we were saying is not whether or not these jobs will be automated, which will depend on a whole host of other societal factors, relative wage levels, but just whether or not the technology might exist to perform those tasks. And actually I think we can be quite confident in some of those assessments in that the technologies we were thinking about here already exist. So really we were drawing upon our knowledge of what exists currently in the lab and arguing that over the next 20 years we'll see that deployed in the field. Things like self-driving cars, for example, already exist. It's just a matter of them reaching the market. So
this is optimistic.
This is optimistic in that sense. There might well be further technological development that we weren't actually picking up.
From what you said, do you think that the future of the universities will be determined by the outlook for employment? In which case, just a double question in one, which do you think is the best subject for us to understand the future? And which will be the best degree to get in order to get happiness, employability, respect, status, and all that stuff?
Hugely complex question.
Machine learning.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. So actually, let me defend my own subject for a second.
Okay, fine.
So I think actually it's an excellent idea if you're thinking about what job might exist, in the future, to think about what will be becoming increasingly cheap. Because you know that if you can be complementary to something that's becoming increasingly cheap, you'll probably still have a job. And I would say a data scientist, a machine learning expert, is in exactly that position because data and computation is becoming increasingly cheap. And in our ability to work with data, we're probably, going to have all these new opportunities opening up for us. And in fact, that's been borne out by the boom in the jobs for machine learning in the recent past. But I think there will still remain a whole host of jobs that will not be automatable. I would look to these bottlenecks that we identified. So to the extent that your job requires a lot of creativity or social intelligence, or to perhaps a more limited extent, perception and manipulation, your job is relatively safe. So I'd say that if your degree equips you to perform those kinds of roles, that's probably a reasonable degree to pursue. This is quite a fuzzy thing, of course, because I don't know exactly how an education can induce the kind of creativity that is actually valued by the employment, but it's certainly something to begin to think about.
Okay. Question from the second now? Okay, one there, and then we go to that side.
You mentioned creativity as being an area that's fairly safe. I've got some bad news for you. I designed an app that draws in my style, and it can probably pick data from somewhere and draw that too. So it could actually turn your phone book numbers into a drawing, for example.
Yeah, well, no, great to hear that. I should say firstly, well,
I agree with you. Good advertising.
So I certainly don't want to give the impression that any of these things is fundamentally beyond the scope of automation. But the way that you would engineer creativity in algorithmic sense is basically picking up patterns that are already observed within some sort of human data set of creative tasks. I don't know that an algorithm is yet able to do the kind of thinking completely outside the box that humans are able to do. I'm not saying that's impossible in the long term. I just think that that's the most difficult thing that remains, to really innovate in a way that humans are able to describe only in a very loose sense. But I think these examples you highlight are super interesting and will allow us to do really quite interesting things.
It's actually quite related to the previous comment, and I was thinking that on a very basic level, I saw this example of someone who had created pretty strict rules, and maybe a one-page excerpt could be created that replicated the style of 50 Shades of Grey. So you would just click refresh, and it would just have a few passages that describe some very tense moments in the book, and it made sense, right? But it was just empty words in a way.
Yeah.
And secondly, not necessarily related to algorithms, but we could think of music. For example, you don't really need a band anymore to create music. you need one person who's got the idea, and then he's got access to the information, to the digital technologies that help him create the sounds that he wants. Of course, there's a debate about performance, and do you pay for performance nowadays, which I would say you probably do more than you pay for the music. But this is also an effect on creativity, that you can centralize it in a way, and that you're not as dependent on a pool of talent as you are on a visionary talent.
Okay, you touched on a few different things there. Firstly, the author of 50 Shades of Grey is not in the audience. I would argue that particular example possibly says more about 50 Shades of Grey than it does about the difficulty of creativity in general. Yeah. But well, I wonder if this is perhaps more formulaic text, that perhaps there are, what we're trying to do in creating text that's really innovative is not exactly the same thing as reproducing novels that are identical to 50 Shades of Grey. That there are challenges there for automating the creation of text that are not the same as just creating things that can endlessly churn out copies of 50 Shades of Grey. But this whole topic of how we actually do innovation is an interesting one. You said that actually perhaps automation will mean that there's more of a focus on individual creators. I'm not sure that's true. I think if we look at the history of innovation, actually, if anything, we've seen a trend towards more collaborative creativity and more creativity through teams of collaborators rather than the individual genius. I think the kinds of creativity we need, particularly in generating technology and science, is now getting so complex that it's beyond the scope of any individual to do alone. In fact, technology has helped in allowing those people to be better integrated and to communicate with one another in a way that's not been possible in the past. The third thing you mentioned was what I would call the kind of superstar effect. I think it's absolutely real. The superstar effect says that a side effect of new digital network technologies is that a single creative person can reach a much larger slice of the market for any creative task, be it the music market or the market for novels, than any previous musician or author would have been able to do. And I think that's absolutely a real effect. It's kind of slightly separate to what I'm talking about in automation, but will only kind of worsen the effects of this pressure upon low-skilled work.
Can I just one short follow-up? Yeah. What about the fact that a lot of the algorithms that are used and created are invisible to the people who are subjected to their consequences? Like, we don't really know what the algorithms behind Facebook are predicated on. So why do we get particular pieces of information that are suggested to us as individuals? And well, in the case of Facebook and advertising, you sort of understand the reason, but it might be in other cases where an algorithm will suggest something to you and you don't really understand what it's about. So it's perhaps a more ethical question about the dimension of how informed people should be about the use of algorithms and responsibility in the end. Who is accountable for suggestions or anything else that result from the work of an algorithm?
Right, so there are a whole host of issues here around privacy and data security, which I'm sure you're thinking about. There's a deeper demand here, I think, for those within the field of machine learning to create algorithms that are more transparent. So I think actually the way machine learning is developed is in creating essentially black boxes that take in data and do some magic and produce something on the other side. I think we could do a lot more within my own field to develop algorithms that really are interrogable in such a way as to be able to describe exactly why they're recommending something to you, and to allow us to either reject that or improve it perhaps in some sort of way.
More questions? Yeah?
So the study in 2013 said 47% of jobs were high-risk. Do you think, considering the accelerating technological progress, if you were to do the study today or in 5 years, it would be much higher than 47%?
Interesting question. We don't have the data really to answer that question to the extent we would like. There hasn't been the kind of update of the ONET data we were using to allow us to answer that in detail. My feeling is that, yes, probably the situation has got worse, that some of the technologies we were only speculating about back in 2013 have begun to have real influence and have led to yet further jobs coming under threat that perhaps we hadn't anticipated back then. But we're really just waiting for the data set to emerge that would allow us to answer that quantitatively.
Your comment about the slide about different industries and the potential risk of automation of jobs. It reminded me of an article I read about a couple of weeks ago, I just dug it out, about Toyota, who are actually beginning to put humans back into the car production line because robots only replicate what they've been told to do, and humans can actually look at something and go, actually, that's not quite right, I can improve on it. So do you think maybe, kind of a twofold question, one that we possibly kind of gone a bit too far, really, in some cases with automation and replacing humans in the chain, and also, do you think that there is going to be, as we move more away from supermarkets to local butchers and go back to more traditional ways, are we going to start as human beings sort of demanding a bit more of a human interaction as opposed to a machine interaction?
Again, a few things in response. I think that example of Toyota is a hugely interesting one. It firstly gives further credence to our claim that creativity, this ability to spot something original that could be improved in a process, is beyond the scope of automation and requires humans to do it. Although I would suggest that Toyota is probably not employing the same number of people in performing that task than it would have in a non-automated factory. I don't think that is the solution to automation. I don't think that's going to generate the number of jobs we would require. On your second point, sorry, which was...
do you feel that we've gone too far with automation? Sometimes humans are going to start craving more human interaction.
Yeah, so that's... Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing because, one thing you could extrapolate from our study is that actually jobs will become more creative and more social and require perhaps a bit more perception. And that's good both for the workers. I mean, these are the kinds of things we will do in our spare time, engage in creative tasks or join a social club, but it's also good for perhaps people buying other products, and that we'll have, if everything else becomes cheaper as a result of automation, as the production of goods becomes much more efficient, we'll have more income that we can devote to, these kind of extra add-ons in social interaction. I can certainly see that being true.
How do you look at actually solution for this, like either broken model or anything, you or any other research going on? I've read a few paper actually on how there is going to be maybe 3 or 4 working days in future, and this kind of stuff. Is there anyone out there looking at?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the billion-dollar question, obviously. What are the policy responses to these kinds of challenges? I would say firstly that I'm an engineer, so if it's down to me to solve this problem, something has already gone very, very badly wrong. But actually, the alarming thing is, having spoken about this issue fairly continuously over the last couple of years, I haven't seen the policy response that I really think solves this issue. So economists who bring it up point to things like improving education, and I think that's probably something we need to do, but I'm not sure how we do it, or that it's the complete solution to these problems. People talk about perhaps increasing innovation. Again, yes, that would be good, but how do we do it? Sorry?
Makes it worse.
Yeah, it could even make it worse and leading to further automation. So the short answer is, I'm not really sure. I mean, you mentioned the 3-day working week, and other people have mentioned things like the basic income guarantee or the universal income with which Switzerland is currently experimenting. But, I'm not sure how we get to that, and I'd certainly be ill-qualified to say whether or not it's actually the economically best solution. So.
But are there research on this? Because I have no idea that there is research on it.
Yes, there is research. People are beginning to tackle these issues, but at least to my knowledge, there hasn't been a completely satisfactory solution.
Okay, we have one last question.
It's been a fear for a long, long time of job loss through technology. Hundreds of years, we are still well employed. And so is the question not so much that this will happen, we needn't fear this, but it's the pace of change that I think is upon us. That's the big concern.
Absolutely correct. So in our paper, we point to all these historical examples of people fearing technological unemployment that hasn't actually transpired. But I don't think that gives us sufficient confidence to say that it won't happen this time, as you say, because of the very rapidly accelerating rate of technological change. So I certainly wouldn't claim that this is definitely going to happen, but given what we can already see computers and robots doing, I would certainly say it's something to consider.
Thank you very much. I think that brings our session to an end. Thank you very much, Michael.